listening to the Marketing Personalities Podcast, a podcast for growth-minded entrepreneurs that serves up valuable insight and interviews about aligning your marketing strategy with your personality type. Because here's the deal. You shouldn't have to feel fake and salesy in order to grow your business. And you no longer have to. Your marketing strategy can feel good to implement and it can work. You can attract the right clients and customers to your business and grow your profits, all while staying true to who you naturally are. So in the name of honest business growth, bring your unique talents, perspectives, and personality to the table. And join us on this week's podcast episode to discover marketing that feels good for you. Welcome back to another episode of the Marketing Personalities Podcast. I'm Brit Kolo, and I'm here today with Cat Rose, who is a coach for creative introverts. So, Cat, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Brit. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
So Kat and I are here today to discuss what it's like to be an introverted creative. And, you know, this month of August is so rich with great conversations around what it is like to be introverted, what that really means, and then how that might apply to these different facets of our businesses. And so in this conversation, we're going to be applying it to creativity. And also in this month, we're going to be applying it to the act of coaching and consulting. We're going to apply it to public relations and being a mom, entrepreneur, like all these different things. And today we get to talk about creativity. But before we dig into that, I want you to get to know Kat. Kat, who are you in this world? What's going on over in your world right now?
Oh, what a question. Well, I guess a bunch of things. So the Creative Introvert, as it currently stands, it's kind of like a mixture of things. So I've got a membership community called the League of Creative Introverts. Like you said, I'm a coach, so I do one-to-one sessions. And I've started doing a lot of more speaking and workshops. So that's kind of what the Creative Introvert looks like, I guess, as a business. But yeah, like I'm obviously more than that. So I have a podcast. I have two podcasts, actually. So really different things. One is the Creative Introvert. The other is called The Seeker and the Skeptic. And that is where I get to express my more like woo-woo new age interests. But yeah, this all kind of started back when I was working in my first job out of university. It was at a design agency in London. And it was, you know, on paper, a perfect job. But I was pretty miserable, actually. And it wasn't until I actually ended up leaving, 3 years in, it took me that long to realize that it didn't suit me and I was miserable. But a friend had pointed out to me after I'd quit and decided to go freelance as a web designer that I'm an introvert. As we were discussing, how I felt in big groups, he kind of realized that I had all the markings of a classic introvert. And when I first was told that, I denied it. I thought, aren't introverts shy? I was a shy kid, but I'm not necessarily shy anymore. What do you mean by an introvert? And he explained, as you likely know, that it's not so much to do with shyness. It's more about where you get your energy and how you process information. And he pointed me towards Susan Cain. And so I kind of, read her book, watched the TED Talk, kind of dug into what was at the time just a really wonderful corner of the internet where there were lots of people talking about introversion. And I learned about the Myers-Briggs test then as well. So yeah, since then since about, I think 2014 or 15, I started writing a blog about my experience with marketing my art, which at the time was pet portraits and, lots of quirky designs on t-shirts. What I was struggling with as an introvert and what I was learning that actually worked much better for me, for my personality type. And yeah, been going ever since.
This is interesting. So where does you kind of just said it, you were doing art. So bridge the gap for me. What took you from, okay, corporate job, not really working out. It sounds like you're just an innately creative human and maybe geared toward artistic flow and artistic venture. And now you coach introverted creatives. So bridge the gap for me. What happened in between there?
Sure. I mean, My like childhood dream really was to draw for a living. I enjoyed drawing and I still do. What I found when I quit the office job as a designer and I tried to kind of do the illustration thing and sell these pet portraits, I realized that it was better for me to kind of keep that as a side gig. But at the same time, while I was doing that and trying to get that off the ground, I was learning a lot about, I guess, turning what you love to do into a business. And I was speaking to other illustrators. So I would go to a meetup group every month. And I realized then that all of us, love to draw, but none of us love to talk about our work or spread the word. And I was kind of like learning a lot about marketing in general. And I was listening to all these podcasts, but I realized that a lot of them were from the point of view, usually of an extrovert who found who marketing and sales came easy to them. And when I spoke to all of these other illustrators at this meetup group, we would need like a couple of pints for the most part to kind of even feel comfortable enough to talk to each other, right? Because we were pretty much all introverts. And that was a pattern I spotted. And I remember having this theory. Are introverts, do they tend to be more creative? I don't believe that to be the case at the moment. I never did an experiment or anything, though I would be interested in any studies on that, but partly because creativity is really broad and hard to define. So all of this to say is I just figured it's going to be helpful for me to figure out ways that other introverts like myself, if they happen to be in the creative industries, and I'm talking about, that's not the same as general creativity, but let's say creative industries, classically like the visual arts, maybe writing, music, stuff like that. How can we figure out ways of marketing that works for us? So it was kind of all like parallel. Like I was working it out for myself as an illustrator. Ultimately, like I said, I ditched the illustration in favor of doing more writing and coaching. But I've definitely taken a lot from what I learned in that time.
Yeah, I can see that. And, I've had a lot of conversations recently with introverts because this month is all about introversion. So lots of conversations, not just on the podcast, but just with, I'm just curious, how this shows up and in all these different facets. And something that I'm finding to be somewhat of a through line is introversion. When you are an introvert, it seems to me, as just from my perspective, I'm not saying this is a rule or anything, but from what I'm picking up on is, especially as an entrepreneur, this deep, I think the diplomats would call it a calling. The analysts might call it like a deep knowing, I don't know, but like this deep calling to do the thing you've been asked to do. And that is the craft, right? Like creating the thing or serving the person or going and doing that thing. And that feels important. And then sometimes marketing can come in, especially in obviously as a business owner, can come in and just feel like either a big distraction, an energy drain, like this thing that just makes you just like, but I don't, can't I just do my thing? And like, can't that be enough? Does that feel in line with how maybe you felt or your clients have felt before?
100%. And I don't think it's exclusive to introverts, but I do think it's definitely, it seems to be across the board in introverts that I speak to. And I've definitely experienced that myself. It's that kind of, you wake up in the morning and you think you've got this great day ahead of you of making art, and that feels really meaningful and important. But as soon as you think about posting on Instagram or whatever, that fills you with fear. Like it's a completely different feeling, and it often feels like a bit of a drag or a lot of a drag. That's why kind of a lot of my work has turned away from what strategies we can put into place. How can we get to a feeling place, which is weird because I'm not feeling dominant at all. But how can we make these things feel better so that we can overcome the internal challenge or the inner critic or whatever, and get to a place where it's worth the pain. It's worth the struggle to hit send on that post or that email. And that's kind of like where my focus has gone.
Yeah.
It's like, how can introverts get to that feeling place.
Yeah. How do you reconcile that? Like, how do you, because I already kind of, well, obviously we're aligned in how we believe in doing marketing, right? And to get to that feel good place. And what it kind of sounds like to me, listeners, you don't know this yet. I'll tell you, Kat is an INTJ. So she's an introverted, intuitive, thinking, judging personality. Okay. So not a feeler, but you've got that intuitive spark, right? So it's still like paying attention to what's going on internally for you. And I wonder, how do you reconcile that with your people? And well, not just your people, but with yourself on those times when you just want to create your thing. I can
Yeah.
think of, this brings up, I'm going in all these different directions. I promise I'm going to get back to the question, but what's coming up really hard for me right now is I'm thinking about my friend Jack. Jack has been on the podcast several times before. I think I speak to Jack every single day, and she's in my mastermind. And Jack is like a straight up INFJ. Like there's no wiggle room. She's like for sure an INFJ. And I see this affinity for creativity. She's a writer, and this really unique balance, I think, that she's learned to find between doing her craft and being that creative being that she is, and knowing that at some point she will need to let people know what's available and what people can invest in that she offers. In the way that I see she's reconciled it is to constantly be asking, like, okay, well, what feels easy to me right now? That seems kind of like her litmus test, her personal litmus test. Like, well, what feels easy? Because I'm not going to force anything. So, like, what feels easy? If it doesn't feel easy today, then it's not going to happen, And that kind of has reconciled that feeling of like, I just want to think and create. So if I have to do some kind of like minimum viable effort here for getting the word out, what's going to feel easiest to do? So that's just like the example coming up for me, but how do you reconcile that in your own work? How do you get to the point where you really just want to be creative and you recognize that there's going to be some kind of communication that goes out to the universe, letting people know that you have this thing to invest in?
Yes, such a good point. And I really resonate with your friend Jack's approach. This is very similar to what I've kind of been doing with myself, and I recommend to other people. I talk a lot about taking things in baby steps.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got this kind of mammoth task in front of you, or you have to do this, you've told yourself you want to launch this product or whatever it is, get it up on your Etsy store. How can you break that down into the smallest manageable components, and then be like super compassionate with yourself when you wake up in the morning and maybe this isn't a super high energy day, and you can just look at that, all of those like little options, and you can just cherry pick from them. And every time you do one of those little things, you do get this kind of hit. I'm not sure if it's not dopamine, but it's one of those kind of brain chemicals. And that really helps build your like self-confidence, your sense of the ability to do things. And it's going to make the other steps much easier to take. And for example, I did this when I first experimented with video. I would make like little 30-second clips of myself on my phone, delete them straight away. But it was my way of kind of building up this muscle and work on that fear response that I had been getting. So yeah, for me and for much of my audience, I always recommend kind of breaking something down into baby steps. But the other thing is trying to reconnect with the reason why you're doing something. So let's say that making this piece of art or, working on this project, that does feel really meaningful and exciting. In order for you to kind of share it with the world, and there is some part of you that has a reason for why you're creating it and a reason to get it out into the world. And it's just remembering that and kind of reconnecting with that when something challenging comes up. And I think often we can lose sight of that. I for sure seen projects that I've started with quite a bit of enthusiasm, and then realized it wasn't worth the effort of marketing, actually. And I didn't love the project enough. And being honest with myself in those moments and being like, okay, I need to find something that's bigger and better than this. So yeah, like embracing that as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, a theme that continues to come up, and you're one of the first interviews that's going to go live around the topic of introversion. So there's so much more coming at the listeners over the next couple of weeks. But just as a heads up, listener, I'm going to give you a heads up on this theme that keeps showing itself in these conversations so you can pick up on it too. And I'm curious what kind of conversations and aha moments can come out of this. But it's this deep need to give yourself permission to do these things in the way that you want to do them. And I've talked to a lot of people, and it's really becoming so apparent to me that that might be, and I don't know this, right? Like, this is not a scientific experiment that I've done. It's just a trend that I'm seeing in the conversations, that maybe this need to give yourself permission might be a little bit more heightened for an introvert than an extrovert. And I wonder, now that I say that out loud, I wonder if that stems from the fact that introverts do, by default, rely on really their own energy to fuel them rather than energy from external sources, because external stimuli, external energy is overwhelming. And so when you stay away from that, and then the effect of that is you back away from the external stimuli. And then what I think I hear happening a little bit is that you then have to rely on your own energy source, and therefore your own permission giving ability, right? To do this thing in the way that you feel called to do it. It's an interesting thing. Do you have anything to add to that now that I'm just, pondering out into the middle of space?
Yeah, I know. I feel like you've like tapped on something that I hadn't put those things together, but it totally makes sense. I'm always interested in like, yeah, where do we get our kind of sense of encouragement, or like how do we feel pushed to do something? Like, I'm quite interested in Gretchen Rubin's 4 tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's a theory I have that introverts tend to be more looking for motivation from within rather than from without. And similarly, if there's part of us that's saying we must do this thing, that voice in our head that says we should be doing XYZ, it takes a lot, but we need to be the ones to, like you said, give ourselves permission. And that's going to be hard coming from the outside. But once we can come to terms with that, that's great. And obviously I can't do that for other introverts, but I encourage them to do it for themselves. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, yeah. So when we start looking at the creative, right? Someone who identifies as a creative, what kind of things do you see the introverted creative dealing with, specifically related to their art or what they're creating? Are they hesitant not just to market the thing, but just like to just allow it to be purchased, or not so much? Like, do you see anything like that happening?
Well, a lot of the people I work with certainly feel that kind of pressure to make it perfect. And again, I don't think this is just reserved for introverts, but it does come up a lot. I think INTJs are often type A's in particular. And I think maybe there are other types who also fall into that category as well. So yeah, so even in the creating of whatever that thing is, the idea of just kind of, put out a beta version, put out a version that maybe isn't perfect or that you'll work on later, that's very difficult for a lot of us. And, similarly, I like to encourage in my community on Wednesdays, we try to show our works in progress. And that, again, it's not so much that we're all there like judging each other's work. It's more so that we can build up that muscle for getting used to kind of putting out something that isn't quite perfect yet. And I think, again, I keep talking about this like muscle, which doesn't, necessarily exist. It feels, part of the brain that we're trying to develop and get used to that feeling of slight discomfort and maybe a bit of fear when we're about to share something that might reveal something of ourselves. I feel like practicing that is is what I encourage.
That's it, right? Like it's when you create something, typically it's going to show somewhat of a vulnerable, intimate piece of you because you're the one that created it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we could talk about this in like an actual physical painting or a figurine that you, I don't know, or writing or really anything. Like it's going to showcase a very real part of you. And just imagine for the introvert who already has a tendency to be sensitive to that external stimuli, when then they might not be putting their own body out there, right? But they're putting a piece of them out there that could potentially be subject to negative external stimuli, like
Hmm.
judgment or critique or whatever that is. I can totally see how that could be overwhelming. But I love your practice element that you provide in your Facebook group, the work in progress Wednesday opportunity. Oh man, that sounds
Hmm.
like a great opportunity for introvert. Well, any creative, right? Any creative, especially introverts, like you said, to build that muscle. Love it.
Yeah, and having a safe space. Again, it's going back to what we were saying about the baby steps and like what's the minimum thing I could do. That doesn't need to be like, going on Instagram stories and being like, oh, I just had this insane morning. And, they don't have to jump to something that's too extreme, but just to share, like I say, a screenshot maybe of something that they're working on. Yeah, that seems to be a good step.
hmm So now I want to talk about your specific personality type, which is INTJ. And I see you doing your marketing strategy from an outsider's perspective. Someone might look in and say, wow, like that almost seems kind of like an extroverted way to market. But I see the intricacies of what you're doing, and I totally see why it's perfect for you. So tell me about what you find to work best for you in your marketing strategy. And then we'll kind of look at it and see why it actually does align with who you are.
Yeah, I would love to know your take on it for
Yeah.
sure, because, I've experimented with a bunch of things. And the number one thing for me over the last couple of years has been my podcast. And I didn't expect to enjoy that quite so much, partly because speaking off cuff and just like, that's always been something that stressed me out from a very early age. Having an opinion and actually expressing that out loud, just not a strong point. But at the same time, I'd been listening to so many podcasts. I knew how much I connected with the hosts, and I was hoping to have that same relationship with my audience. So again, that was my buy-in, that was my why, and that was big enough to overcome that initial fear. The way that I made the podcast introvert friendly for me was initially scripting all of my podcasts. And I still do that with my solo shows. I script what I'm going to say and I might ad lib here and there. But just to have that gives me great, a sense of ease. And trust me, it would be much better than me trying to make something up off the top of my head. And then when it comes to the interviews, I realized that I actually really love one-to-one conversations anyway. So again, that suited me. As long as it's one person that I can focus on and not like a group of people, I'm in a happy place there. So I wasn't ever doing anything that was too outside of my comfort zone. But at the same time, doing that over time has helped me to develop other skills in that area and like expressing myself vocally, which again, not a strong point. And yeah, there have been other things that, I've dabbled in and that don't seem to suit my personality type, like Facebook ads. I learned a lot about Facebook ads, and I realized at a point that my lack of sensing ability was not doing me any favors. My ability to pay attention to detail sucks. And while I could do a great strategy, actually implementing the details, I really struggled with. So I've been organically advertising ever since. I haven't done any paid advertising in many years. And maybe I'll return to it. But yeah, I'll be hiring somebody else to do that.
Yeah. Okay, so many good things in here, and I want to dig in because this is so rich with good nuggets. Not just for INTJs, although if you're an INTJ listening, you're probably going to come away with a lot, but also really for anybody wondering how to make their marketing strategy better, or just kind of like looking at their own strategy, finding what feels good, and then knowing why, right? So what I see in your strategy from afar, I would see an INTJ doing a podcast, and I'm like, maybe my first inclination would be like, wow, that kind of seems a little extroverted, but okay, like I can, all right, maybe it's working, maybe it's working. And then I look closer and I realize that you hit on the two things: the scripting, right? So you're not just going in there off the cuff, like maybe like an ESFP would. ESFP doesn't need the strategy, doesn't need the plan ahead of time. She's going to turn the mic on, hit the record button, boom, off and running. Who knows where she's going to go, but it's going to be fun for her. And because it's fun for her in that light, she doesn't feel bad about showing up that way. Her audience will dig it, right? On the flip side for you, without a plan, you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Wait, what are we doing? How are we making this work? So going in with a script is key. And also you hit on the other thing of those, it's a one-on-one conversation. So I think a lot of times, some people will look at podcasting and video and think that's not for an introvert. That's way too extroverted. And really, in reality, everybody listening, whether you're introvert or extrovert, whatever, and whatever kind of like preconceived notions you've had about those types of marketing, I'm podcasting right in this second, this moment. So is Kat. And we're totally alone. You're alone, right, Kat? Like nobody, like we're not in the same room.
Mm-hmm.
We're having a one-to-one conversation and I'm totally alone. She's totally alone. So it's really not that extroverted of an activity. And the same thing for video. Now, live video is a little different because you do get that back and forth, and that can be a little overwhelming, I think, for some introverts. But if you're just recording a video, it's literally just you and the webcam, man. Like that's it. I like that. And I also like how you've identified that the technical Facebook ads might not be totally right for you. And maybe, you probably have the strategic mind to come up with the vision and the strategy, but then putting it into actual play might be better suited for maybe like an observing thinker as opposed to an intuitive thinker.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what you were saying about the podcast and the video, what I also love is that you can edit it again. So it's any of that, you've kind of got that wiggle room. And I think that is very calming for many of us.
Yeah, totally. Yes, exactly. So we're going to wind down, and I want us to land on, I'm curious if you were talking to an introverted creative right now, which I know that there are plenty of them listening right now. What would you like to give them permission to do or not to do in their creative business?
I think, first of all, get clear, look at what you're currently doing. And I'm going to kind of go back to that feeling place, like try to find how you feel about each of those things. And if anything feels sticky, I mean, there are differences here, right? So there are things that feel hard or challenging, but they don't necessarily feel gross, right? And that's different. So one feels like fear, but it also feels a lot like excitement. Whereas the other kind of feels like, you're shaking hands with somebody who you've just seen like kick a dog or something. It feels gross. It doesn't feel good.
Right.
So, I mean, these are two different things. And it's good to go with the one that feels like kind of scared, but kind of excited. But the one that feels like really not good to you, work out a way to either ditch it altogether or delegate it.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's really kind of getting honest with yourself and going through all of the things. And if it doesn't, I'll go a bit Marie Kondo, if it doesn't spark joy, then really have a think about what is it about that. And like you said, kind of going back to that thing about permission, giving yourself permission that you don't have to do it all yourself. You don't have to be on video and have a podcast and have a blog and do all of this other stuff. Again, I've kind of cut off a lot of the things that I don't think are in my wheelhouse, and maybe I will come back to them. I probably will in many cases, but to just focus on one or two strategies is totally fine.
Yeah. Love it. That's such great advice. Thank you so much for that and your time today, Kat. This has been great. Before we go, could you please tell the listeners where they can find you online?
Sure. Thank you, Brit. Yeah, you can find me at thecreativeintrovert.com and say hello on Twitter or Instagram at Creative Intro. But I love to connect. So feel free to email, do whatever you want to do. I will reply.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, you heard her. Go check her out at thecreativeintrovert.com. Of course, links in the show notes, along with a couple more resources that we recommended in this episode. And as always, to find a marketing strategy that feels good to you, visit marketingpersonalities.com. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Marketing Personalities Podcast. Now it's time to connect your marketing strategy to your personality type. Go to marketingpersonalities.com/MPP to download your marketing personality type full report. Use the code MPP at checkout to get $10 off. And that's a super special code for podcast listeners as a way to say thank you for being here. In your full report, you'll learn about your personality type, how it relates to the work you do, what your best marketing strategy includes so you can start implementing it right away, what your worst marketing strategy includes so you can avoid it, and so much more. Go to marketingpersonalities.com/MPP to get your full report and use the code MPP at checkout to receive $10 off your purchase. And one more thing before you skip on to the next podcast. Would you please share this episode with your entrepreneur friends who also need to feel good about their marketing strategies? Take a quick screenshot of your podcast app right now and share it out via text, Facebook, or my favorite, Instagram. Remember to tag me at Marketing Personalities in the photo so I can be sure to send you a huge high five and thank you for sharing the love. This podcast is edited and produced by the Podcast Engineers. They're pretty great, and you can find them at podcastengineers.com. That's all for now. Thanks as always for listening, and I'll catch you back here next week on the Marketing Personalities Podcast. Love ya. Bye.